11 a.m., October 2nd, 1944. Along the Worm River on Germany's western edge, the first wave of American infantry waited in a shallow fold of ground, close enough to hear German machine guns testing their aim, and close enough to smell the river mud rising under their boots. Ahead, beyond the waterline, sat a low ridge cut with concrete mouths, pillboxes and bunkers that had been poured years earlier, then reawakened as the war rolled back toward the Reich. Men had given this barrier a single, confident name: the West Wall, the Siegfried Line. A platoon leader kept his eyes on the far bank, trying to read shapes through broken hedgerows and the sharp geometry of obstacles that did not belong to nature. Dragon's teeth, dark against pale soil, formed a jagged row that seemed designed less to stop tanks than to make men feel small. Somewhere beyond them, a hidden crew waited with pre-sighted fire, convinced that any assault across open ground would slow, bunch, and bleed. The order would come without ceremony. Down the slope, into the river, up toward the first concrete blockhouse. No grand breakthrough promised. Only a series of small, brutal problems that had to be solved one bunker at a time, with whatever the infantry carried in their hands and whatever they could invent under pressure. Inside the concrete rooms of the West Wall, German confidence rested on habit as much as on steel. The fortifications had been designed for a specific opponent and a specific idea of war. Thick walls, interlocking fire, carefully measured kill zones. This was a system built to punish frontal movement and reward patience. And the men assigned to hold it believed they understood their enemy well enough to predict what would come next. From the German perspective, American infantry were a blunt instrument. Effective, yes, but dependent. They advanced best when tanks led the way and artillery spoke first. They were thought to be cautious, methodical, and, most importantly, uncomfortable when stripped of heavy support. Against beaches and hedgerows, this approach had worked. Against concrete bunkers and pre-sighted machine guns, the assumption was that it would stall. Reports circulating through West Wall units repeated the same expectation. The Americans would probe. They would test the line. Then they would pause. Engineers would be brought forward. Artillery would flatten what could be seen. Tanks would wait for cleared lanes. Time would work in Germany's favor, because time meant regrouping, reinforcement, and the chance to stabilize a front that had been collapsing since Normandy. This belief shaped everything. Defensive fires were planned to break up massed movement. Ammunition was stockpiled for short, violent engagements, not for weeks of close combat. Some bunkers were left undermanned, not because they were unimportant, but because it was assumed the Americans would not reach them quickly. The wall itself was expected to do most of the work. What the defenders did not fully grasp was how much the war had already changed the men approaching their line. By late 1944, American infantry units were no longer learning on the job. They had crossed France under constant pressure, adapted to terrain that offered no clear doctrine, and survived fights where improvisation had mattered more than planning. The assumptions embedded in the concrete of the West Wall were already outdated. As the first American squads prepared to move forward, the Germans waited for a familiar pattern to emerge: hesitation, regrouping, delay. What they did not anticipate was that the attack they feared least was the one already forming. Not a grand assault, but a steady, relentless push by small units that had stopped waiting for perfect conditions. The wall was built to stop armies. It was about to be tested by individuals. When the order finally came, it did not sound like the beginning of history. It was brief, almost casual, passed from one man to the next, absorbed in silence. The platoon rose from cover and moved forward in a loose file, boots slipping on wet ground as they approached the riverbank. There was no cheering, no sense of spectacle, only the awareness that once they crossed, there would be no clean way back. The river itself was unimpressive, narrow, slow, easy to underestimate. But on the far side, the terrain rose sharply into broken ground dotted with concrete shapes that blended into the earth. From a distance, the bunkers looked abandoned, like relics from another war. Up close, they revealed firing slits cut with precision, angled to cover every likely approach. The silence around them felt intentional. The first shots came without warning. A burst of machine gun fire snapped across the river, kicking water and mud into the air. The men scattered instinctively, dropping low, pressing themselves into the ground. There was no single target to return fire against, only a sense of direction, a shadow where sound and impact seemed to originate. This was not a battle that unfolded across a map. It was a series of moments measured in yards and seconds. A squad pinned behind a fallen tree. Another probing forward through brush, trying to locate the source of fire without exposing themselves. Radios crackled with fragmented reports that offered little clarity beyond one truth. The wall was very much alive. As the advance continued, it became clear that no single action would decide the day. Each bunker operated as its own island of resistance, connected to others by fields of fire rather than physical proximity. Neutralizing one did not open the way forward. It simply revealed the next problem waiting a few dozen meters ahead. Fear traveled faster than orders. Every movement forward felt personal, deliberate, and irreversible. Yet so did every small success. A firing slit suppressed. A grenade rolled into a blind corner. A moment of quiet where there had been noise before. Progress was measured not by distance gained, but by resistance removed. By the end of the first hours, the American unit had not broken through anything that resembled a line. They had not captured a decisive position, or raised a flag over a shattered strongpoint. What they had done was more subtle and more dangerous for the defenders. They had entered the system, learned its rhythms, and discovered that it could be approached, understood, and slowly taken apart. The wall had been designed to stop momentum. Instead, it forced the fight into a form where momentum no longer mattered. Nothing about the fighting that followed resembled the kind of victory planners preferred to imagine. There was no single hour when the line cracked, no sudden collapse that could be marked on a map and announced in a communiqué. Instead, the days blurred together into a pattern of contact, pause, adjustment, and advance that resisted simple description. Each bunker demanded its own solution. Some could be suppressed from a distance, their firing slits blinded by concentrated fire. Others sat too low, too well concealed, forcing infantry to crawl close enough to feel the rough texture of concrete under their hands before they could even attempt an attack. Progress depended less on orders from above than on decisions made by sergeants and corporals who learned, often the hard way, which approaches invited death, and which offered a narrow chance. The absence of a dramatic breakthrough was not a sign of failure, it was the nature of the fight. The West Wall was not a wall in the traditional sense. It was a web of mutually supporting positions designed to absorb pressure and deny the attacker any moment of release. When one point went quiet, another would come alive. When a position was taken, it revealed how little that single success actually changed the wider situation. For the Americans, this was exhausting in a way that large, fast-moving operations were not. There was no sense of forward rush, no clear momentum to ride. Every step had to be earned, often under fire that felt intimate and personal. Losses came in small numbers, but they came repeatedly, eroding the illusion that patience alone would guarantee safety. Yet something else was happening beneath the surface. The defenders, waiting for a pause that never seemed to arrive, began to notice the same unsettling pattern. The Americans did not pull back after probing. They did not wait for ideal conditions. When stopped, they adjusted. When blocked, they went around. When pinned, they learned where the fire came from and remembered it. The line was doing what it had been built to do, slowing the advance inflicting cost, denying spectacle. But in doing so, it also revealed its limitation. A system designed to resist a decisive blow had no answer to pressure that refused to become decisive, pressure that simply continued, bunker by bunker, position by position. There was no moment when the West Wall was breached. There was only the growing realization on both sides that it could be worn down. What finally defeated the West Wall was not a new weapon or a sudden change in doctrine. It was a pattern that repeated itself so many times that it stopped feeling improvised and began to feel inevitable. The Americans learned that they did not need to defeat the entire system at once. They only needed to make each bunker irrelevant. The process was slow, deliberate, and deeply unglamorous. A bunker was located, not always seen, but identified by sound, muzzle flash, or the way fire swept a particular patch of ground. Once found, it was isolated. Infantry maneuvered to deny it clear lines of sight. Supporting weapons were positioned not to destroy the concrete, but to suppress the men inside it. The goal was not immediate capture. It was silence. Engineers moved forward under cover carrying explosives that had been adapted on the spot. Standard charges were reshaped. Fuses were shortened. If a firing slit could not be reached from the front, men crawled to its blind side. If the entrance was protected, they sealed it. If the bunker could not be taken immediately, it was left contained, its crew trapped, cut off from the fight unfolding around them. Coordination mattered, but not in the way pre-war manuals described. There was no elegant choreography between arms. Instead, there was constant communication at close range. Shouted warnings, hand signals, quick decisions made under fire. Small unit leaders adjusted plans in real time, using terrain and timing rather than formal maneuver to gain advantage. Night became an ally. Darkness stripped the bunkers of one of their greatest strengths: visibility. American patrols moved closer, probing defenses that had been untouchable in daylight. A position that dominated an open field by day could become blind and vulnerable after sunset. Each night attack reduced the line a little more, even when no ground was officially taken. Over time, the system began to fail in ways its designers had not anticipated. Bunkers still stood, but they no longer supported one another. A pillbox that could not fire without exposing itself became a liability rather than an asset. Crews inside learned that remaining active invited destruction, while staying silent meant being bypassed and isolated. This was how the wall was broken, not by force, but by relevance. Each bunker that stopped firing created a gap, not in concrete, but in confidence. The West Wall remained on the map, but on the ground it was being dismantled piece by piece, decision by decision, by infantry who had learned that they did not need permission to adapt. The Germans had built a barrier to stop momentum. The Americans responded by removing its reasons to exist. The change did not announce itself with an explosion. It crept in quietly, carried by rumors and long pauses on the line. German crews began to notice that neighboring bunkers, once loud, reassuring sources of covering fire, were falling silent, not destroyed, simply gone. Their guns no longer spoke. Their signals no longer answered. What had been a tightly connected system started to feel like a collection of isolated rooms. This was the moment the West Wall stopped functioning as it had been intended. Its strength had never rested solely in concrete or steel. It had rested in certainty, the belief that any attacker would hesitate, mass, and expose himself. When that belief eroded, the geometry of the defenses worked against the men inside them. Firing meant drawing attention. Silence meant being bypassed. Either choice carried risk. As American infantry continued to move forward in small, persistent pushes, German decision-making narrowed. Crews waited longer before opening fire. Some positions conserved ammunition that had been stockpiled for a climactic assault that never came. Others abandoned bunkers that were no longer mutually supported, choosing mobility over confinement in concrete that had become a trap. Reports traveling up the chain of command reflected a growing unease. The wall was still there, but it no longer felt like a line. It felt porous, unreliable. Worse, it no longer imposed fear. The psychological effect had inverted. Instead of slowing the attacker, it now burdened the defender with the knowledge that each position might be the next to be isolated and erased from the fight. For the Americans, this shift was unmistakable. Resistance did not vanish, but it changed character. Fire became sporadic. Counterattacks lost coordination. The defenders were no longer confident that the wall would protect them if they simply held on. The fortifications had been designed to reassure those inside them. Now, they did the opposite. This was the true collapse of the West Wall. Long before maps were redrawn or official communiques issued, its power as a symbol had failed. Concrete still stood. Dragon's teeth still scarred the ground. But the idea that this line could decide the battle was gone. The wall had not been shattered. It had been exposed. When the fighting along the West Wall finally faded into the background of larger operations, there was no single date that marked its end. No photograph captured the moment it stopped mattering. And yet, for both sides, its significance had already been settled long before the front officially moved on. For Germany, the loss was deeper than terrain. The West Wall had been more than a defensive line. It had been a promise, a final barrier that would buy time, restore balance, and force the enemy into a costly pause. When that promise failed, it became impossible to ignore the larger reality it revealed. If even this line could be entered, understood, and dismantled by infantry advancing without spectacle, then no fixed defense inside the Reich could be trusted to hold indefinitely. For the Americans, the lesson ran in the opposite direction. The fight confirmed something that experience had been hinting at since Normandy. Success did not always come from overwhelming force or perfect plans. It came from adaptation, from small units willing to adjust under pressure, to accept incremental progress, and to continue moving even when no dramatic breakthrough seemed in sight. The West Wall did not reward speed or bold gestures. It rewarded persistence. Strategically, the implications were quiet but decisive. With the psychological value of the line gone, subsequent German defenses lost much of their deterrent power. Fortifications could delay, but they could no longer shape Allied expectations. The initiative remained with the attacker, not because the defenses were weak, but because their aura of inevitability had been stripped away. In the histories written after the war, the Siegfried Line would often appear as a footnote, a set of concrete obstacles overtaken by events. What those summaries miss is what the men on the ground understood in 1944. The wall did not fail because it was poorly built. It failed because the war had changed, and the people attacking it had changed with it. The American infantry who moved through the West Wall did not deliver a dramatic victory. They delivered something more enduring. They proved that even the strongest defenses are only as effective as the assumptions behind them, and that once those assumptions collapse, concrete alone cannot hold a war in place.